When we left off, we had built this login form in HTML and CSS, and it still didn't do anything. So as I mentioned before, now we're going to do two things. One, we're going to validate this form. We're going to make sure that at least that the user doesn't try to submit an empty form. There's a lot that you can do when it comes to validation, but for right now, we're just going to make sure it's not empty. And once we've validated, we're then going to send this information off to a simulated backend service, where if this were a production environment or if this were a real web application, we'd be sending out the email and password to an actual server somewhere or execute some server-side code. They would then check this information against a list of known users and return a response that says, hey, this is a real user, the email and password are good, or no, they're not, something's wrong. So we're going to do those two things, starting with validation. So coming back over here, the first thing I want to do is start to separate our concerns. And by that I mean we're going to make some extra files to keep this stuff in instead of just piling it all into our HTML. So I've copied all of our styles, and I'm going to now make an extra file that's going to be called login.css, and here I'll make it. And this is where we're going to put all these styles that we just copied. And now if I save this and hop back over, nothing has changed. So now our styles are just in a separate style sheet, which is convenient, helps keep our HTML clean. Likewise, as we add our JavaScript, we're not going to write it here. We're going to write it in a separate JavaScript file that's going to be called login.javascript. Oops, not return. Cool. Oops, and I need to make this a path. And that file doesn't exist yet, so let's make it. Login.js. Cool. So let's start thinking about what we're going to do here. First of all, I want a function that's going to fire when I click the submit button. So I'm just going to start writing out some JavaScript here, and I'm going to say, well, the first thing I want is function submit form. And what is this going to do? This is where I'm going to do one thing or another thing as a result of my authentication. So authentication is going to take place somewhere else. This is kind of my main function that I'm going to execute that's going to kind of pass off responsibility to my other functions that will handle any other sub-processes of this. So what am I going to do? I'm going to say if the form is valid, and I'll make that a function. How about this? We'll say we'll say form validation status equals form is valid, and we'll say if form validation status is true, means that it's valid, then we're going to say form is valid, otherwise form is not valid. You could ask a dozen different people and probably get a dozen different answers about how exactly to structure this, and my approach is really going to be, again, to separate concerns as much as I can. This is generally a good practice, but again, there's lots of different ways that you could approach this. So we are going to now make a separate function for this form is valid. Let's just call this, that's a little bit more clear about what exactly this function is doing. We're going to say validate form. Function validate form, well, what is this going to do? Validate form is going to take the inputs, so I'm going to say let input, I'm going to do this on two lines at the same time. I'm going to hold option and click the second line so I can write these at the same time. I'm going to say let input email equal document dot get element by ID, and I'm going to give these an ID of input email and not in out. Input email, I'm gonna Command D to select the next instance of the word email and say password. So I'm going to get these two things, and I haven't done this yet. I'm just going to kind of go through my logic first. So I'm going to say if input email is not empty and if input password are not empty, if both of these are not empty, then this function is going to return true. And then, so if it's true, then the form will be valid. Otherwise, the form will not be valid. So I'm going to say if input did I spell it right? Input email, right? If input email, and we've got to check the value because all I did was get the element, which is this is an input element. To get its value, I just call this the dot value, and I'm just going to say if it's falsy, and this means if not input email dot value, which we'll check in this case for a falsy value, which can be null, undefined, not a number, 0, or empty string. Maybe I'm missing a few, but that will be covered here with undefined. If we just don't enter anything, the value of that input should be undefined. So if the input email is undefined, we're going to say, I've kind of got an idea here. I'm not simply going to return true or false. I'm going to say return. I'm going to return an object with a status of false and a message of please enter an email. Okay, and this will be useful, I think, later on, and you'll see as we go on why I want to return this object. I don't like the idea of throwing a response from here. I want to handle kind of all of my core logic here, and that includes any kind of responses. So for instance, if the form input is not valid, I want to throw that from here and handle that from here, because if it's valid, but then the email and password mismatch, I also want to throw that from here. Again, I like the idea of this handling everything, so I want to make sure that whatever I pass this function enables it to do that. Well, if I just return false, and all I know is that this has returned false, I don't know how to notify the user. So I'm going to return this object where I can just check form validation status dot status. That seems a little redundant to say status dot status. We'll leave it for now. And then I'm going to say if input password. Oops. If input password dot value is falsy, we're going to return a status of false and a message, please enter a password. Otherwise, I'm going to return, oops, that was kind of gross. I don't need an else. This is called a bouncer pattern or a guard pattern. And the idea is I'm not doing ifs or elses. I'm just doing a series of ifs. And because if this condition is met, I'm going to return. That means that if this is met, then this one will never be hit. Nothing south of this will ever be accessed if this condition is met. And so the idea is that you kind of have to get through this guardian, you have to get through this guardian in order to make it to the end. And so I can assume that if I'm executing this, that this has not been tripped, right? This has not been evaluated to true. So by the time I get to the bottom, I can assume that these have both evaluated to false, which means that if I get to the bottom, I can assume, okay, all of my validation criteria have been met, therefore I can return my passing object, which will say return with a status of true and a message of form is valid. Smiley face. Okay. So in this case, I'm going to say I'm just going to alert my form validation status dot message. Same here. In fact, yeah, I'm just going to do it both. I'm going to keep this if statement here because I think it'll be useful later. But basically, in either case, I'm just going to alert the message, but I'll just throw an extra alert here. Well, we'll say reason, something like that, and then I'll say here success. How about this? How about this? Success is valid. An error occurred with a reason why. Okay, so this is the basics of validating my form. So what do I need? I need to get these IDs and assign these IDs to my input elements. So I'm going to say my input email is going to have an ID of input email, and this is going to have an ID of input password. And then when I click on my button, I want to submit form. I think that's what I called the function. Cool, submit form. I am famous for overlooking simple things and screwing up in a very simple way. So let's make sure I didn't do that real quick and then go take a look. So if I do log in without doing anything, I should get that error message that says email is empty. An error occurred, please enter an email. Cool. An error occurred, please enter a password. Success, form is valid. Cool. Okay, so validation works, right? I'm successfully executing this logic, which is checking the form validation status, and if it's true, then we've got our success message, and otherwise that means it's false and an error occurred, and then we get our error message. I'm going to add a condition just to show you. So if I wanted to say, well, you know, I need to beef up my front-end validation, and I'm going to add another one to say I want to make sure that my email at least includes an @ symbol. And then I'm going to give this a custom message. Again, you can see why this return object is convenient. I'm going to say email address must include an @ symbol, right? So now let's try it again. Reload. Password. So I've got my email, got my password. This would have worked before, but now I'm checking for the existence of an @ symbol in my email, and because it didn't exist, I threw an error. What if I do a £? Still mad at me. I have to do an @ sign, and now success. Form is valid. Cool. So this is kind of the world's simplest form validation, but this idea is going to carry through kind of, no, not any way you decide to do validation, but this is a good start. So we've got validation down. So now what are we going to do? Now we're going to make our pretend backend. Our pretend backend here. And here's what this is going to do. We're going to say validate user. How about authenticate? Authenticate user. Okay, and this is going to be really truncated and really simplified, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to say the user authentication we're going to send to our backend, and we're going to say, hey backend, here's my username. We're going to say username and user email and user password, and I'm going to check that against my list of known users and their passwords. So a really simplified way of doing this would be having a constant, just if we're doing this in JavaScript, all users, and that equals just a list of users, and we'll just do key value like any object. So I'll say user1 at mail.com, and this person's password will be password. Okay. And let's just pretend like we've got at least a couple users for this application. And we're going to have a user 2, and this is just where we're pretending like this is our pretend database where we're storing usernames and passwords in plain text, of course, which you never do, but this is, again, just to get the point across and imagining we have this function that's going to authenticate our user and give us a result that we can work with. So what authenticate is going to do is it's going to say, okay, well, we're going to say if the email and the password that we have for this, match, then we're going to return true. So what are we going to do? First of all, the user is going to give us an email. We need to look that up in this list. And since this is an object, we can do that by saying all users at the key of, oops, I don't want to actually copy that. I want to say at the key user email. So if the user email that gets passed in is user1@mail.com, it's going to jump right here. And this will evaluate to the value of all users at this key. Well, what does that evaluate to? This value. So when this gets evaluated, it will be replaced essentially with password, with the string password. So what are we going to compare? What are we going to compare that to? Is the supplied password. And we're going to say, okay, does the password that we have stored at this email address match the provided password? If they do, that means that the user email and password match what we have stored, and therefore the user is return. We're going to say, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have our backend return the same type of object as our front end does. Status true. And then we're going to say message authentication successful. Then we're going to say otherwise we're going to return false. And we're going to say username or password are incorrect. You never want to say which one is incorrect because that can give people too much to work with if they're trying to sneak their way in. If you just tell them the password is incorrect, well, at least now they know that this username exists, for instance, right? People can use this to snoop around and find out more about you than you'd like them to. So now we're going to use this new pretend backend authenticate user, and we're going to jump back up here. So what we did before is we said if form validation status is good, then we're going to proceed. That means it's valid. So then we're going to call authenticate user, and we're going to pass in this user email and password. So I'm going to grab that here, and we'll just do the same thing, even though this is a little redundant, and there's probably a better way to do this. We're just going to say input email, and we can just do input password dot value dot value. So we're going to pass this in, and then we're going to say we're going to return authenticate user. How about this? Let's just say let auth status equal whatever gets returned here. And then we're going to say I could probably do this in a little shorthand, but I'll be a little more verbose just to be clear. If auth status dot status is true, right? If it returns true, and I'll be extra clear, if we're looking for something that will evaluate to true or false, I don't have to say if it is equal to true. I can just say if auth status dot status, but I'm going to throw in the true just to be extra clear. If it comes back as true, then we're going to return, or we're going to alert success. And then we're going to concatenate that with auth status dot message. Otherwise, we're going to alert an error occurred. Oops. Error. Should do a colon here. Auth status dot message. So if the form is valid, then we're going to call our authentication service and then store its response in this auth status variable. We're going to check to see if it's true, and if it's true, we're going to say great and give you this message. Otherwise, we're going to say uh-oh and give you this message. And here, you would do different things in a production environment, but for right now, we at least have our condition broken out where we would handle success here and we'd handle failure here if they didn't successfully authenticate. And we're going to throw something back in our else and say, okay, if the form validation status is false, then we want to say alert error form validation status dot message. And I should probably be more clear. I should say authentication error, authentication success, and we're going to say form validation error, so that at least our errors are a little bit more descriptive. Let's hope I didn't do anything crazy. And try this again. So what do we expect to happen? First of all, let me clear this all out. Oops, I don't want to save this. I want to reload. Okay, if I click login, form validation error, please enter an email. Cool. Form validation error, email address must include an @ Okay, gotta do that. Form validation error, please enter a password. Authentication error. So now our form is valid and we've tried to authenticate, but now we get an auth error that says username and password are incorrect. Okay, well, what's a real password and username from our quote-unquote database? Well, we've got user1@mail.com as a known user, and his password is password, P-A-S-S-W-O-R-D. Log in. Authentication success. Authentication successful. Okay. So, I mean, that was a lot of shorthand, but it gets the job done, and I think it illustrates the point. If you're starting off, looking for a sample project of, kind of getting started and doing a login form as an exercise, I think this shows you a lot of the basics that will set you up to take the next steps. Understanding the ideas of handling the different operations in your JavaScript with different functions with dedicated purposes, but also breaking out your validation from your pretend backend, or from your authentication from backend, separating your validation from your authentication, that these are different. And also, this idea of handling return objects with messages that you can then display in one place, and being descriptive about those. I think that's going to do it for this example, or for this kind of code along. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thanks.